Be honest with yourself for a second. Are you a faithful tither? Do you drop that 10% in the plate every single week, the way they told you to, believing that if you don't, something bad is coming for you? Now, here's the part. Nobody stands up front and says out loud, Jesus never once collected a tithe, not from Peter, not from John, not from a single person who followed him. He walked around that land for 3 years, he handled money, he had a treasurer, and not once did he tell anyone to hand over 10% of their income to him or to his ministry. So how did we get here? How did a practice that Jesus himself never asked for become the #1 thing preached from stages every Sunday morning? Where did the 10% rule actually come from? And who does it really serve? Stick around, because when you follow this trail back, it doesn't lead where you think it does. Let's start with the thing everyone gets wrong right out of the gate. We talk about the tithe like it was one simple thing, 10%, money in a basket, clean and easy. But that's not what the Old Testament describes at all. Under the law of Moses, the tithe wasn't money. It was food. It was grain, wine, oil, and animals from the flock, farm produce from the land of Israel. And it wasn't one tithe either. Read it carefully, and you find at least 2, and by most counts 3 separate tithes. The first one is in Numbers chapter 18. God tells the tribe of Levi they get the tithe of everyone else in Israel. Why? Because the Levites were the priestly tribe, and they were the one tribe that got no land of their own. Everybody else inherited territory. The Levites inherited the tithe instead. So this first tithe was basically a support system for a group of people who had no farm, no fields, no way to feed themselves, because their whole job was running the tabernacle and later the temple. Then there's a second tithe in Deuteronomy chapter 14. And this one is going to surprise you. This tithe you ate yourself. You brought it to Jerusalem. And you and your family and the Levite in your town all sat down and consumed it together in a feast before God. You didn't give it away. You threw a party with it. And then every 3rd year there was a 3rd tithe stored up locally and handed out to the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow, the people with no safety net. Add all that up, and the honest math is that faithful Israelites weren't giving 10%. They were setting aside more like 20%, some of which came right back to their own table. It was a national system, part welfare, part clergy salary, part religious festival. It was the tax code of an entire theocracy. Now hold that picture in your head, because that's the thing modern churches point to when they ask you for 10% of your paycheck. A food-based, tribe-based, land-based system tied to a temple that has not existed for almost 2,000 years. So what did Jesus do with all this? Here's what people miss. Jesus lived and died under the law of Moses. He was a Jewish man, born under that covenant. And while he walked the earth, that system was still standing. The temple was still there. The priests were still there. So, of course, the tithe still applied in his lifetime. He never told people to stop obeying the law they were under. But watch how he talks about it. There's really only one moment where Jesus directly addresses tithing, and it's in Matthew chapter 23. And it is not a sermon on giving, it's a rebuke. He looks at the Pharisees and he says, "Woe to you, because you tithe your mint and your dill and your cumin, and you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness." Think about what he's actually pointing at. These men were so obsessed with the rules that they were counting out individual leaves of the herbs growing in their gardens to make sure God got his exact 10% of the spice rack. And Jesus isn't impressed. He's disgusted. He says, "You nailed the tiny stuff and you completely missed the point. You've got the 10% down and you've got no justice, no mercy, no heart." Yes, he adds that they shouldn't neglect the small things either. So he validates the tithe as part of the law they were living under. But read the whole thing and the message is unmistakable. The percentage was never the point. The heart behind it was always the point. And a man who can tithe his garnish while ignoring the poor at his gate has understood nothing. That's the closest Jesus ever comes to teaching tithing. A warning about using it to fake being holy. Now, if you've sat in enough services, you've heard the comeback to all this. Somebody stands up and says, "But tithing came before the law. Abraham tithed." It's in Genesis, and that's true. It's in Genesis chapter 14. Abraham gives a tenth to a mysterious figure named Melchizedek, a priest-king of Salem. The writer of Hebrews later builds a whole argument on it. But go read what actually happened, because almost nobody does. Abraham had just come back from a battle. He'd rescued his nephew Lot and recovered a mountain of plunder from a defeated army. And out of that war plunder, that one-time windfall of stuff that wasn't even his to begin with, he gave Melchizedek a tenth. One time, off the top of spoils of war. And here's the detail that never makes it into the sermon. Abraham kept none of the rest for himself. He turned around and gave the entire remainder back to the king of Sodom. He didn't pocket a fortune and tithe on his salary. He gave away war loot in a single moment of gratitude and walked away with nothing. That's the model. A one-time, voluntary, spontaneous act, not a weekly withdrawal from a paycheck for the rest of your life. When somebody uses Abraham to justify a recurring 10%, ask them one simple question. When did Abraham ever do it a second time? He didn't. There's no record of it anywhere. So let's go to the people who knew Jesus best. The apostles, the men who built the first church. Surely, if the tithe was supposed to carry over, they'd have said so. They didn't. Read Paul. Paul spends real time in his letters talking about money and giving, especially when he's raising a collection for the struggling believers in Jerusalem. This is the perfect moment to lay down the 10% rule, if there was one. And what does he say? In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, he says each person should give whatever they've decided in their own heart to give. Not reluctantly, not under compulsion, because God loves a cheerful giver. Stop and feel the weight of that. Not under compulsion. The exact opposite of a rule, the exact opposite of a fixed percentage with a threat attached. Paul hands the decision back to the individual and to their own conscience. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, when he organizes the actual collection, he tells them to set aside a sum in keeping with their income, in keeping with what you have, proportional, personal, and completely voluntary. No number, no 10%, no penalty if you fall short. The earliest Christians shared what they had freely. They sold possessions and met each other's needs. But there is not a single verse where an apostle commands the church to tithe. The word tithe, used as a rule for Christians, simply is not there. So we've got a strange gap. Jesus didn't collect it. The apostles didn't command it. So who did? Here's where it gets interesting. And here's where you find the fingerprints. For the first few centuries, the church ran on exactly what Paul described. Voluntary offerings, free gifts. People gave because they wanted to, and leaders were supported out of that generosity. No fixed percentage. Then the institution grew, buildings went up, a professional clergy class emerged, bishops, priests, staff, all of it needing steady, predictable income. And voluntary giving is a lot of things, but predictable is not one of them. So the church did something very human. It reached back over the head of Jesus, past the apostles, all the way to the Old Testament tax code, and it pulled the tithe back out of the grave. The paper trail is real. In the year 567, the Council of Tours started pushing the idea. Then in 585, the Second Council of Macon in France made it official. Pay your tithes or face excommunication. Let that sink in. They attached the threat of being cut off from God and the church to a 10% payment, something Jesus never did, and Paul explicitly refused to do. And then it got locked in as actual law. In the year 779, Charlemagne, the most powerful ruler in Europe, wrote the tithe into civil law across his empire in the Capitulary of Herstal. Everyone must tithe. Not a suggestion from a preacher. The law of the land, enforced by the state, collecting for the church. So the 10% you feel guilty about skipping did not come from the mouth of Jesus. It came from a series of church councils and a Frankish emperor who needed a reliable revenue stream and who found the perfect tool for the job sitting in the book of Numbers. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to conclude, but ask yourself this: why is it that the one financial idea that never appears as a command from Jesus or from Paul is the exact financial idea that gets preached the hardest and the most often from modern stages? Of all the things they could emphasize, why that one? Maybe it's the honest answer that an institution needs money to run, and a fixed percentage is simply the most efficient way to fund it. That's a fair and reasonable position. Buildings cost money, staff have families, ministries feed the poor. There is nothing sinister about a group of people funding a mission they believe in. But there's a second reading, that somewhere along the way an ancient tax for a tribe that owned no land got rebranded as a personal command from God, complete with the threat of a curse if you hold back, precisely because guilt and obligation raise more money than a cheerful heart ever will. Two readings, same set of facts. And notice how much easier it is to keep a rule alive when everyone assumes it's God's rule, and nobody stops to check whether the man they follow ever actually said it. So here's where I hand it to you. Jesus never collected a tithe. The apostles never demanded one. The 10% rule was reintroduced by councils and emperors centuries after the fact. Those are just the facts on the table. What you do with them is yours to decide. Maybe you see faithful, cheerful giving that keeps a good mission alive. Maybe you see an old obligation dressed up in new clothes. Maybe it's somewhere in between. I really want to hear your honest opinion on this one. Not the answer you think you're supposed to give, your real one. Are you a tither? Do you believe the 10% is a command from God or a tradition built by people? Drop it in the comments and tell me why. And read what other people are saying too, because this one always gets a conversation going. And if this made you look at something familiar in a completely new way, subscribe and stick with the channel, because we are just getting started pulling these threads.